thing about literary studies. Thank you.
And the synthesis you've all been waiting for, so we'll have our two speakers come up to the front. And how is the volume on this microphone? It sounds kind of low from up here. It's okay, okay. So we have just a quick instruction to the speakers. We have these desk microphones. You click the button. There you are. And it's quite necessary to use these, because otherwise the answers get swallowed up really, really quickly. So what we have also is a traveling microphone. And yeah.
Sorry?
Do you want to just pass it around, or? Sure. Yeah. So Jonathan will pass the mic. I will recognize the legitimacy of the hand,
and we will reply.
And they will reply. It'll be a network kind of in performance. So, without further ado, who will be the first node? We have one from James. Great.
I could just speak loudly, but you want me to use the
I think it's better to use the microphone. You just never know.
Okay. It's on? Okay. Thank you very much both for fascinating talks. My question is directed to Professor Moretti. I'm very interested in your discussion of networks. I'm a historian of science. The model of networks that I'm familiar with is that of actor network theory and metrology. And just an observation quickly, that one thing that struck me with your own very fruitful, very intriguing analysis by comparison with the work that I know, is that the history of science work most recently emphasizes really a kind of decentralization of the networks. So I was struck by your formula, the centrality of Hamlet, say, indispensable to the network. But does your analysis also engage equally, and maybe it does, and maybe you've said this, and maybe this is asking for a clarification, does it engage equally with the notion that the protagonist at the center is also constituted by the network? I took you to be perhaps suggesting this with your emphasis on some of the peripheral figures, and your suggestion that, of course, there's a larger geography at stake that connects to Elsinore from outside. So I wondered if your analysis, one of the other additional uses of your analysis, might be that we could start to somehow chart narrative plot outcomes with certain characters in terms of their ability to manage information, contacts, across distance, so that they somehow are keeping themselves parts of networks, of flows of information, flows of social prestige. And I ask that because that's really a very strong and fruitful emphasis in recent science studies. So just one example to wrap up this point. Instead of seeing Newton as the center of a network of late 17th century information flow, and he's constituting a kind of global network of astronomical observations that will make possible the Principia. Newton is made possible by his ability, in collaboration with others, to make himself some sort of a passage point for what is in fact always a potentially unstably, highly distributed, flowing set of relations, informations, and social connection.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think that its most fruitful equivalent in literary studies would not be characters in plays or novels, but writers. Say, instead of seeing whomever you want, Walter Scott as a central figure in the historical novel, or Jane Austen in sentimental fiction, seeing them as, and find a version of what you just said about Newton. Plays and novels are artificial structures, so it's an interesting, and they're artificial in more ways than one. I will just mention two, which make them somewhat different from natural networks, it seems to me. So natural networks, i.e. networks that come about without anyone doing them, whereas this is written by someone. So there is first, they're much smaller, right? They're just much, much smaller, especially plays. Hamlet has, compared to a lot of 17th century plays from France, a lot of characters. I mean, many Racine plays have 7 or 8 characters. I started this working with Ibsen's plays. At times they have 5 or 6 characters. I mean, there is a network, but what exactly can you do? This is a theory that works with huge measures of data. That's why it would be important to insert other types of quantities, like the quantity of words that flow between characters. That may go in that direction. The second, it's a subtler difference. In every network, say some other discussion in the history of sciences is relationships between scientific papers. What papers get quoted, and some get quoted by a lot of people, other get quoted by fewer people. This, I suspect, but this is something that I would have to work. I suspect that the distinction between central and peripheral in artificial networks like plots is greater than in natural networks. Why is that? Because, you know, for instance, in an Ibsen play, not here, but in an Ibsen play, there is a maid and a nurse in Dollhouse. There is a maid and a nurse living with the family, with the Helmer family. They interact with Nora, with her husband, with the guests. They never exchange a word between them. Now, this is supremely unreal. In a natural network, they would probably sleep in the same room, etc., etc. For the purpose of the play, that's not necessary. So plays are more selective in terms of, and that may be a further bias. But, you know, you were saying we're at the beginning of the beginning. We've been doing this for 15 years. I've been doing this for 15 weeks. So, you know, you can imagine that I think I'm overconfident already.
Excellent. Next question. Why don't we go right to where you're standing?
Hi, this is a literary question, but it's directed at Professor Stich. So there's an emerging.
The answer is I don't know.
Yeah. Well, let me give it a shot. So there's an emerging sort of discipline in the field of English that sort of looks at the history of emotions, how subjective experience was sort of felt across different time periods. So, say, what it was like for an audience member during like one of the early performances of Macbeth. And so the problem with this is that it's very difficult to get this information because it's relying on sort of like fourth removed information about, you know, what it's not only what someone's sort of reasoned response was to Macbeth instead of, say, their actual intuition, but it could be, for instance, you know, someone relating what the other person's experience was. And so do you think there's any way to, say, use experimentation like Simone Schnall's research on how people responded to a sort of dirty room versus a clean room, how it affected their disgust response? If you could sort of like bridge that to sort of say, well, you know, the experience of being in the playhouse in the 16th century was sort of a filthy, dirty place, and that would affect someone's subjective experience of Macbeth in ways X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, well, it's an intriguing idea, and I guess my first reaction to it is that one thing we don't know enough about, but we're beginning to find out a little bit about, is which features of systems like the ones I was talking about, or emotion systems more generally, which ones are universal or pan-cultural or innate. These aren't the same, but they overlap significantly. And which ones aren't. And